Right, so we're recording now. So I'm delighted to have Stephanie West with us from the Natural History Museum. And yeah, so please let us know by either asking a question in the chat or raising a virtual hand if you have any questions. But maybe I'll start off with a question. I think my favourite thing that I didn't know before your talk was about the menagerie in the Tower of London, and I found that really, really interesting. And we know that Gilbert White was interested in animals that weren't British wildlife. For example, he travelled to see a moose and things like that. And it seems really odd to me that I can't recall it being mentioned by him in any of his letters that he can hear lions. I feel like that would be a Gilbert White worthy diary entry.
You'd have thought he would have mentioned it, wouldn't you? And especially, you know, I mean, there are records of, being able to hear lions roaring around the streets and how they were echoing between the houses. I'm surprised it's not in there. And that just makes me wonder, sort of, you know, Gilbert writes down certain things and not others. And I'm almost wondering if there are, you know, little notes and little things. Maybe I need to go through the letters in more depth when I've got some time and actually see what he's saying to his brothers and things, and his other correspondence, aside from what actually gets, you know, put into his journals and his obviously his publication, because there's just little things in there. It's like, you would have thought that if you were in London staying in Thames Street, that would be the first place you would go and try and get into amazing animals. And it had been there for a long time as well. It's not like it was a new thing.
No, I totally agree. I think that's a massive omission in Gilbert White's letters, because I certainly think that if Gilbert White had seen a lion, we would know about it. So Graham, you had a question. Would you like to ask?
Actually, it follows. It was about menageries that I was going to ask about. So I've been researching the menagerie on extra change on the Strand. So actually, it was on your map. It was when you had your box. Was it Temple in that box on the presentation? Literally, the bottom left corner of the map literally points at the menagerie. I guess though, actually, it was probably a little bit late in terms of Gilbert White. When did Selborne, when was that first published?
1789.
89, yeah. So literally, it would have the menagerie would have been just pretty much established in the few years just running up to that publication.
Okay, so it would have just started. But again, you would have thought that, you know, that would have itself been quite exciting.
To follow on from that, then, so when did Gilbert White die? Sorry, I'm pushing you.
It's 90. Oh gosh, brain's just
93.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I didn't know. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there isn't a big window, is there, between the public?
No, and he would have at that point been quite elderly. So how might have been travelling in 50 years? I
was just wondering if there was anything written. Was there much written? Do we know of much written after the publication? Did he continue to keep the diaries? As you say, if he's already elderly, is he no longer coming up to London?
So the journals continue until just a few days before he dies.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He's not necessarily, he's writing perhaps more about his garden a little bit, obviously, as he's getting quite elderly by that point. So he's referring to, you know, I think that, I was looking at this the other day for a different thing, and I think his last post, as if he's on Twitter, his last journal entry, is, I think it's 12 days before he dies. I think it's on June the 15th, and he died on the 27th, 1793. So he was still corresponding with his brothers and things like that. You know, obviously, you know, not necessarily making those journeys, but definitely talking to his brothers, who, particularly for something like that, you would have thought they would mention. So again, that would be another interesting thing to see if
certainly by 1790 the menagerie was really quite established on extra change. I mean, they they had a rhinoceros, they had a lot of animals, but bizarrely, it wasn't on the ground floor. The animals, they had to take really quite large animals upstairs. It was on the first and second floor.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to cause comment in its own right.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, certainly Jane Austen, which seems to be a little bit of a running theme today as well, but certainly Jane Austen mentions hearing the lions. I don't think she ever visited. I can't find any evidence that she actually visited inside Exeter Change. That would have been a little bit later. That would have been about 1813, 1814. But she certainly comments about hearing them from, because again, her publisher was just down the road. So she was in, she visited the Lyceum Theatre, I think. So she could certainly hear the animals, smell the animals, but I don't think she actually visited herself. But
yeah.
at that time,
have we got Louise on here? Does Molly mention that at all?
Hi, yeah. I don't think she does. No, she's really, really silent on all things natural history in her letters. It's really weird.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. I'm going to have to go back through some of the letters, I think, if I can find that.
So, I mean, in terms of Gilbert White in London in his latter years, a lot of his brothers, so brother Benjamin, by that point would have moved back down to Hampshire. So he lived in Bingley for his last few years. So he would have had less reason to visit London in his latter years. There's a quote from that I used in Facebook not that long ago. I think it's from 1791, where he talks about they rebuild Benjamin's publishing house, and Gilbert White notes that Benjamin, his brother's grandson Benjamin, so that would have been Molly's son Benjamin, laid the first stone, and he was 5 years old, and Gilbert White hoped that he would remember it into the 19th century. But that's sort of probably round about the last kind of times that Gilbert White probably would have visited London. He didn't like traveling at the best of times.
Yeah, he was not a fan of going gnats, dust on the road, and yes, he's really quite aggravated about the about having to travel. But yeah, I don't think he would necessarily have visited there, even though he may have been fascinated about it. Oh yeah, there's my dad. Hi, Dad.
I published an article fairly recently on another reverend, on William Bingley. He was a little bit later, but he was more of a compositor. So he produced a book called Animal Biography, which came out in the autumn of 1802. It sold very well. It went through about 7 editions. But there is a letter there, he'd written a letter. It's not sure who it is. Sadly, it's unnamed, but it's very clear he wants a letter of introduction to Benjamin White, because it's a composite. It's a natural history book, and he wants to be circulated or distributed by Benjamin White, just because everybody he is the person in terms of natural history books at the time.
Yeah, and you can really see how good a location that Benjamin White's publishing house would have been, because everybody interested in natural history who was in London would have been there walking past it, and it would have been a real hub. So yeah, was it actually published by Benjamin White? No,
it wasn't. No, strangely. So there's more to. So I've done a quick. I've written just a kind of an overview of William Bingley, but at the minute there's a draft manuscript actually about the publication of that book. Okay. So I think it's not complete. It's about 75% complete. So there is a little bit more digging in to do. But no, it wasn't actually published by. There was no association. But which is interesting in itself, because he was clearly trying to establish one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting. Look forward to the publication as well.
Can I make just one final point and then I'll shut up? I'm really conscious of dominating. So when you were talking about Gilbert visiting London and certain things not being recorded, perhaps some rather oblique references. I mean, it could well be that sometimes if it perhaps wasn't seen to be so unusual, why would you record it? If it wasn't seen to be exceptional, you know, if things were fairly easy access, or he had reasonably regular access to some of these things, it could well be that you just don't record it.
Yeah,
you know,
perhaps.
you tend to perhaps record what you consider to be a little bit more unusual.
Yeah.
So it could well be that he was more of a regular visitor to some of these places, but for whatever reason, it didn't actually seem to warrant recording.
Yeah. It perhaps wasn't as extraordinary. Louise mentioned in her talk about Molly that Molly seems to have preferred the Laverian collection to the British Museum and found that more interesting. So it might just have been because that one caught his eye, and there was something specific that he wanted to remember about it. It's obviously, I'm completely biased. Of course, the original British Museum collection would have been amazing too. But yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, to think about what you do note down in your own journals if you keep one as well. I mean, I've been trying to keep a kind of Gilbert White-esque natural history journal this year, but it's interesting thinking about the things that I have noted in that and the things that I've omitted, and to actually think what may not be in Gilbert's journals, as well as what is there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that.
So, in terms of, we've got a question about peregrines.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. I think Gilbert White does talk about peregrines, and he certainly talks about birds of prey.
Yeah, he does quite a lot. Yeah.
I don't know whether he spots any whilst in London, but certainly. In Hampshire, he would have.
Yeah, nothing in London at all. Yeah, no, he definitely, birds of prey come up quite a bit, don't they? And he talks about them. He converses directly with Thomas Pennant, and I think sends him a specimen of. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is.
I don't know.
Have a look. Dad, I'll talk to you about that later.
Okay. So one thing I was thinking about when you were showing the maps and mentioning Vauxhall, one of the things that always strikes me about the statue of Hercules in our garden is how it sort of reminds me of the sort of wooden facades that they would have had at pleasure gardens like Vauxhall.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, you know, way before I listened to your talk about, you know, whether Gilbert White got the idea for creating the, you know, illusion of a classical statue by, you know, visiting somewhere like, you know, Vauxhall or Branley Pleasure Gardens. But as far as I am aware, he never talks about visiting Vauxhall.
I know. I mean, you would have had to pay to get into Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, obviously at the time. So whether or not that was something that he thought was worthwhile spending money on, I don't know. You would have thought it was quite an attraction at the time.
Yeah, I mean, he liked to party.
Yeah. Oh, great. So Molly mentions it. That's interesting.
Oh, okay.
You can imagine actually the sort of, you know, quite fashionable, behatted London Molly, yeah, taking tea in Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. That's a lovely image, isn't it? Whether or not the country gent of Gilbert White would have found it quite as attractive, I don't know. But you know, obviously that was the thing to do in the local area, wasn't it? The place to be seen. And yet some of perhaps Gilbert's more modern ideas, like the Hercules statue, may well have come from seeing things like that in London, and that, you know, brand new, wonderful experience of seeing new ideas, which would have then seemed completely new in a Hampshire village.
Yes, well, I mean, it's definitely an unusual aspect to the grounds, and I don't know of many other sort of examples of that. So we had to get the idea from somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions before we wrap up? I want to see if we can get finished by the time the poem Graham.
Just a very quick one. Sorry.
Sorry.
Is there any, given that he's not that far from perhaps what, Southampton, perhaps a bit further, or at least the south coast? Is there evidence of visiting the kind of the south coast and the ports? Because certainly they were the sources of quite exotic animals. Certainly Gilbert Pidcock used to stock up the menagerie. You know, he used to go around all the various ports.
Yeah, I mean, he mentions Portsmouth a couple of times.
Yeah, but not in an animal, not in an exotic animal type context.
No,
No,
not particularly.
It tends to be more about ships coming in and out and who he knows on them when he's in, or in some things, being able to hear the guns from Selborne.
Yeah. Yeah, the guns he mentions a couple of times, doesn't he?
Okay. But almost that's almost an interesting omission again then, because certainly by that time, literally by that time, every ship was coming in with exotic animals. Every ship,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
mainly fairly run-of-the-mill smaller things, but parrots, monkeys, you know.
And I think almost it might have been so regular. I mean, you think about, there's letters in the Royal Society that I was looking at right at the start of March, actually, fortunately just before everything got closed down. There he's talking to his brother over in Gibraltar about sending a flamingo over, which obviously would have arrived at Southampton or Portsmouth, I would imagine, from Gibraltar, to then be sent on to the Royal Society. And in theory, that, I don't think it's in their collections anymore, but there was a flamingo specimen that was sent to the Royal Society by John over in Gibraltar at Gilbert's suggestion. But again, I've not seen any reference in the journals to that arriving.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for that.
We better wrap up as we are getting near Catherine Beavis's the first time this poem has ever been performed being. So I will just say thank you very much, Steph. Steph is on Twitter, so if you have any more questions.
My talk.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.